For a lot of people, COVID vaccines for kids can feel like a lose-lose proposition. Either you choose not to vaccinate your kid, and then they could get COVID and die. And that's terrifying. Or the alternative is you choose to get your kid vaccinated, and then you're injecting this new vaccine that was just created last year into your totally healthy kid. And that's also terrifying. A lot of parents are understandably paralyzed with fear over this decision, and that's why we're here today. As a pediatrician, I talk to parents every day about their questions and concerns, which is why I'm pretty confident that by the end of this video, you'll have enough information to be able to make a decision about whether the COVID vaccine is right for your family. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about the options, because there are several possible paths that you can choose from. 1. Fully vaccinate your child. Great. 2. Elect not to vaccinate your child. Also reasonable. 3. Get the first dose and then delay or skip the second dose. This one's not my favorite. One problem with the strategy is that there's a possibility that if your child did get COVID, that their partial coverage might make it more likely that they could develop a variant or be more susceptible to a variant. You get some antibody protection after the first shot, but you get the benefit of the development of cellular immunity after the second shot, which provides you with higher quality and longer lasting protection. 4. Put off vaccination for now, until we get more data. This is an option, but it's also not my favorite, although there are some justifications for this that we'll talk about later. If you're going to do it anyway, you might as well get the most benefit out of it. If you're going to take the risk of getting the vaccine now versus getting it 1 year from now, it's the exact same risk. If you're going to do it anyway, you might as well benefit from the protection you'll get right away. If you're waiting to see if something else is going to happen in the long term, then that's an argument that's based on some faulty logic, and we're going to talk about that later. So those are the 4 options. So let's dig into the points that you might want to discuss with your co-parent, or things that you might want to mull over. So grab a pen and paper and let's dig in. Firstly, let's talk about why it might be reasonable to elect not to vaccinate your child. So at this point, we know that kids, or teens, tend to do well with COVID. They tend not to get very sick if they even become symptomatic at all. If you're vaccinated, or the adults around your child are vaccinated, then you could reasonably elect not to vaccinate your kids, knowing that they could get COVID, and if they do, they'll probably be okay. And while they could spread it to other people, those people will probably be unvaccinated people. So those other unvaccinated people will either be other kids, who are also unlikely to get really sick, or they're competent adults who have made the decision not to get vaccinated. So here's the rub. I have heard some people argue that if you do make that choice and that happens, then it's okay, because those unvaccinated adults made that conscious decision. So if they do get sick, they brought it upon themselves, and it can be tempting to get all victim blamey. But I don't think that people who make that choice not to get vaccinated are necessarily bad people. These are people who probably just read some very compelling misinformation, and once you're down that rabbit hole, it can be hard for people to get out. If you happen to watch a video or pause in your scroll to read a post that contains some misinformation, the algorithm notices. Once you demonstrate to a social media platform that you engage with certain types of information or misinformation, the platform will start to show you more and more of that type of content, making it more likely that you'll have the opportunity to engage with more content that contains misinformation, and the cycle continues. The more you see a piece of information, true or not, the more you believe it. And social media algorithms aren't designed to selectively spread accurate information. They're designed to show you whatever information you've engaged with in the past, whether it's true or not. Along those lines, you may have a friend or someone in your family or the parents of your kids' friends who are choosing not to get vaccinated. And maybe Uncle Bob is pre-diabetic and has high blood pressure, and maybe he's carrying around a little more weight than is ideal for his height, and frankly, maybe he's pretty high risk. And just because he's an adult who's exercising his right not to get vaccinated doesn't mean you want your asymptomatic teenager to accidentally kill him. Or maybe your in-laws are hardcore anti-vaxxers and you still want your kids to be able to spend time with your grandparents without you having to lose sleep over it. All I'm saying is there are a lot of factors, even independent of the risks and benefits to the kids themselves. And just like with any medical decision, you need to take all of it into account. We're going to talk about the risks shortly, and you can decide by the end of the video whether or not your assessment of the risks outweigh the benefits. But given that kids tend to do well with COVID, that limits the amount of medical benefit that they can get from vaccination. We're going to talk about the other benefits of vaccination in the second half of this video. If you feel that those benefits don't apply to your family, then it might be a reasonable choice for you to elect not to get this vaccine. So, another reason you might decide not to vaccinate your kids is a concern about the potential side effects. So, before we dig into this topic, I think it's important to review which vaccines we're talking about. As of right now, only the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has received authorization for people under 18 years of age. They received authorization in December 2020 for adults 16 years and up, and mid-May 2021 for kids 12 to 15 years, at least here in the US. Moderna just released its data from its trial in kids 12 to 17 years, and it looks equally impressive, so we definitely expect them to be applying for their EUA shortly. So we're really just talking about the mRNA vaccines right now. If you've heard anything about blood clots with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the Oxford AstraZeneca or any other side effects with any other vaccines, those aren't applicable to this discussion because we don't have any data on those vaccines in kids. So let's talk about the potential side effects of the mRNA vaccines. There has been some discussion about a very rare side effect associated with this class of vaccines called myocarditis. There have been reports of some cases of myocarditis primarily showing up in younger men in the first week following vaccination. The US hasn't released our numbers yet, but Israel, who has been leading the world in vaccination, has released their numbers. In Israel, 5 million people there have been vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine specifically, and they reported 62 cases of myocarditis, mostly in men under 30 years, and usually in the first 4 days after immunization. It happened most commonly after the second dose, and just like in the US, the cases have been mild so far. So if you do the math, based on the numbers that we have from Israel, that works out to be about 0.001% of the people who are vaccinated getting myocarditis. So we're also going to compare this to the rate of myocarditis in COVID infections in about a minute. So you may be wondering, what is myocarditis? Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle itself. It's problematic because it can not only affect the heart's ability to squeeze and pump blood through your circulatory system, but it can also lead to heart rhythm problems that can actually be really bad. So how would you know if you or your kid has myocarditis? They might have chest pain, most importantly. I guess chest pain is primarily when it's associated with pericarditis, but they might have chest pain, or they could have shortness of breath, palpitations, maybe even blurry vision, or fever and chills, syncope, leg pain or swelling or headache, or they might have a totally mild presentation that doesn't lead to any symptoms at all. And like I said earlier, you can get myocarditis for lots of other reasons. You can get it from other infections. In fact, infection is the most common cause of myocarditis. You can get myocarditis from infections like parvo B19, measles or mumps, or rubella or polio or Coxsackie or adenovirus or CMV or mono. You can get myocarditis from pretty much any infection you get from a tick or anything that stings you, like wasps and scorpions and certain spiders. You can get myocarditis from certain autoimmune diseases like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. Certain medications can also do this, a lot of chemo medications, but also amoxicillin. You can get it from toxins like alcohol or carbon monoxide. There are a lot of different ways to get myocarditis. So what do we do if you get myocarditis? Most cases self-resolve. Most cases go away on their own. But if you do need some kind of intervention, primarily we use medications to support your heart function. So medications to improve the effectiveness of the heart's ability to squeeze, or even medications to lower blood pressure so the heart doesn't have to squeeze as hard. We might use oxygen support, so the blood that the heart is moving around is maximally oxygenated. And depending on how severe it is, there may be a lot more. But most of the time, it's mild and it's self-limited, and most people recover fully without any long-term sequelae. So we do have to be careful because we haven't definitively determined causality for this myocarditis, because there are clearly a lot of reasons you can get it. There's a 1 to 7% baseline rate of it in the population at any given time. We don't know if the vaccine is leading to myocarditis or if we're just catching it after vaccination, because that's when we're paying really close attention. So just like the rate of ice cream consumption is correlated with the rate of shark attacks, but we all know that ice cream consumption doesn't lead to shark attacks, or vice versa. Just like the average global temperature is correlated with the number of wrinkles on my face. Are my crow's feet causing global warming? I don't think so. These two things are correlated, but they're not causal. They just happen to be occurring at the same time, but one thing isn't leading to the other. But I do think, and this is just my opinion, I do think that there's biological plausibility that these two things are connected, and here's why. The reason I think that they might be connected is one that you may have heard before, and that is that you can also get myocarditis from a COVID infection. In fact, earlier this year, the AAP released guidance recommending that children who tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 at any point in the last year be evaluated by their pediatrician to get clearance before being allowed to return to sports. The reason for this is that we were finding more and more cases of myocarditis not just in older people who were critically ill, but in younger athletes and even in people who had mild or even asymptomatic COVID infections. So as of right now, the rate of myocarditis in COVID infections is estimated to be between 3 and 5%. The rate of myocarditis associated with vaccination is closer to 10 per million, or 0.001%. And the cases of myocarditis associated with vaccination have been mild, which is often true for those associated with COVID infection, but not always. And this association is something that we also see with other infections and vaccinations. People are terrified of getting Guillain-Barré from the flu vaccine, but you're much more likely to get Guillain-Barré from the flu infection than you are from the flu vaccine. And nobody talks about getting Guillain-Barré from a flu infection because I think on some level, everyone's aware and apparently comfortable with the fact that if you get sick, you could get some real complications. And it just doesn't make the news when that happens, despite the fact that it happens much more frequently than it does following vaccination. So this pattern of complications of infections being mirrored in the side effects of vaccines is something that we see with other vaccines as well. So I do think that despite the fact that we don't definitively know that myocarditis is causally related to the vaccine, it does seem to have biological plausibility. But again, because of these numbers, I'm not sure that it's logical to make the decision not to vaccinate based on this potential side effect. It's fairly clear that the likelihood of getting myocarditis in the absence of vaccination is higher than the likelihood of getting myocarditis from vaccination. Okay, the next thing that a lot of people are concerned about is the potential for long-term consequences. And I think this is a completely understandable concern. It's a new technology and a new virus, and the vaccines came out less than a year ago. So I think it's understandable that people would want to know how we know what's going to happen in the long term. I have another video that explains how mRNA vaccines work and how they could be produced so quickly, and I'll link that in the description below. But you're right, we can't know with absolute certainty what's going to happen in the long term, how people will react 3 decades in the future. We just don't have that data. But the good news about all of the vaccines in the past that have had some terrible side effect that have been taken off the market, the good news is that all of these side effects showed up within 6 weeks of receiving the vaccine. And this is why the FDA required that the vaccines be studied for at least 2 months from the last dose, because they knew that there's never been a serious vaccine side effect in the multi-century history of vaccines that hasn't presented in the first few weeks after administration. So there may be a serious side effect that lasts for a long time, or may even be permanent, but they all show up in the first 6 weeks after vaccination. By now, about 390 million mRNA vaccines have been given worldwide, so we can be reasonably confident that we've seen all of the serious side effects that we're going to see. In other words, you have a side effect that we haven't seen yet, and you're not just 1 in a million, you're 1 in 390 million. And you would have to be catastrophically unlucky to get a serious side effect that we haven't seen yet. Because of that, depending on your risk tolerance, if you're comfortable with the evidence supplied by the first 390 million people, then unseen long-term side effects probably isn't a great justification to avoid vaccination. Now, you may feel differently. Maybe your risk tolerance is lower than mine in this respect, or maybe you just don't believe me, which is fine. If not, I would propose that you check out VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or look on Google Scholar to review side effect profiles of vaccines that have been created so far. I'll put a link in the description below to a video from an infectious disease specialist at CHOP, which is the children's hospital that's ranked either 1 or 2 in the US, depending on the year. Okay, so what about practical reasons that you might not want to vaccinate your child? Firstly, it's inconvenient. Just like getting the vaccine yourself, you may have to take time off of work to bring your child to get their vaccines, not just once, but twice. In addition, they might feel bad. The fever, fatigue, body aches, headaches, these are all symptoms that you experience when your immune system is ramping up. You have these same symptoms when you get sick for the same reason. They're not caused by the infection. They're actually caused by your immune system. And the younger you are, the more robust your immune response is to vaccines. So there's a good chance that your child will have all of the regular vaccine reactions. Maybe not after the first vaccine, but probably after the second one. And these last 2 aren't a huge deal, but they are factors. A lot of people have had their work and school schedules disrupted a lot this past year, and you may not be excited about or capable of taking more time off. Now, you may not think that these are adequate reasons that justify not getting vaccinated, but they are based in reality. If you choose not to get your child vaccinated for this reason, I might disagree, but that's just because I have different priorities, and that's okay. If you choose not to get your child vaccinated because of misinformation that made you afraid, that would be unfortunate. I would hate for you to make a decision that affects your family's health based on information that isn't true. So how about ethical reasons not to vaccinate your child? The younger you are, the less likely you are to have a significant negative outcome from a COVID infection. One of the basic principles of medical ethics is the principle of justice, and one of the 4 things we have to consider when evaluating justice is the fair distribution of resources. You could argue that if your healthy 13-year-old gets a COVID vaccine, that's one more dose that a 73-year-old in India or Brazil isn't getting. And that might be a gross oversimplification of global vaccine distribution, but yeah, that's a reasonable point. If you wanted to wait 2 or 3 months for vaccine manufacturing to catch up to demand, that might be a reasonable choice. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about some of the reasons that you might have seen on social media to justify not getting vaccinated that aren't so much based on good quality evidence. 1, these vaccines will not affect your fertility. And this is actually a really sophisticated misinformation campaign. It's based on the fact that there's another spike protein called syncytin-1 that's involved in attachment of the placenta during pregnancy. The concern was that the vaccine would produce antibodies that would also fight this spike protein, making you prone to miscarriage. The problem is that these spike proteins are completely different proteins. They just happen to both be called spike proteins. In the initial Pfizer trial, 23 women got pregnant, and only one who miscarried was in the placebo group. If there was a significant enough similarity between the 2 spike proteins, we would see a wave of infertility and miscarriage in women who had COVID and developed their own natural antibodies to the spike protein, and we just haven't seen an increase in infertility in that population. There have been 30,000+ pregnant women who received mRNA vaccines, and data from the vSafe registry that follows people after vaccination shows that pregnancy complications in that population are actually lower than the general population. The next one is, if your child had COVID, they don't need a vaccine. So this is partly true. There is some residual immunity that you get following a COVID infection. However, we're not sure how long it lasts or how robust it is. One reason that we're concerned about this immunity is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus suppresses certain aspects of your immune system during infection, and this actually prevents the development of certain types of immune protection. So this is why people will often say the protection you get from a vaccine is superior to that of natural infection, because with vaccination there's no virus suppressing the development of any protective responses. So the next one is that the vaccine contains a microchip from Bill Gates. This rumor was started when Bill Gates discussed starting a digital vaccine record, but he wasn't proposing that we microchip you, like your dog. He was talking about the possibility of using a dye, kind of like an invisible tattoo, to be able to demonstrate your vaccinated status. But it couldn't be used to track you, like any more than a regular tattoo could be used to track you. The next one is that if you get the vaccine, that you could shed the vaccine to people around you. So that couldn't actually happen with any of the COVID vaccines that we give here. Vaccine shedding only happens with a certain type of vaccines that we call live attenuated vaccines. These vaccines, like the rotavirus vaccine or the varicella vaccine, they contain a weakened version of the virus that allows your body to produce a really robust response to the virus without it making you sick. So these weakened rotaviruses can be shed through the stool, but there's really no significant shedding from any of the other live attenuated vaccines that we give. And again, none of the COVID vaccines that we give here are live attenuated, and so they're not actually capable of shedding because there's no virus in them. Here's a few more. The technology is brand new. The vaccine inserts viral genomes into your DNA. Testing the vaccine was rushed and can't be trusted. I did a thorough discussion of all of these topics in another mRNA vaccine video. So I guess what I'm saying is, basing your vaccination decision on the points from this most recent section would kind of be like deciding not to let your child wear a bike helmet because Instagram told you that bike helmets cause cancer. You can do it, but if you make a healthcare decision based on bad information, it could negatively impact your child's health. The problem is that sometimes it can be hard to tell what information is good and what isn't. If you're not sure, make a note of it and bring it up with your child's pediatrician. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to review the data with you to make an evidence-based choice. Even with this video, you may not trust me, and that's okay, but hopefully you trust your child's pediatrician. Actually, if you don't, you may want to get a new pediatrician, because you should definitely feel comfortable with your doctor, and you should feel like you can trust the advice that they give you. So now let's talk about 5 reasons why you might want to get your child vaccinated. So let's get the obvious one out of the way. If you get your child vaccinated, they probably won't get really sick from COVID. The COVID vaccines, especially the mRNA ones, are spectacularly effective. This means that if you get one, you don't really have to worry much about the people around you who either chose not to get vaccinated or were too young to get vaccinated. The Pfizer trial included about 20 to 2,300 kids, and they were split 1-to-1 into placebo and vaccine groups. Throughout the observation period of this trial, there was a total of 18 cases of COVID, and all 18 cases were in the placebo group. So you may have already done this math, but in case you haven't, this means that for this trial, the vaccine would be considered 100% effective, since there were no cases in the vaccinated group. Now, obviously, when we give the vaccine to larger groups of people, it's probably not going to continue to be 100% effective. But it's still really good news, not only because it's spectacularly effective in adolescents, but also because it was tested recently here in the US, where presumably we're being exposed to different variants. The UK variant, and maybe the South Africa, and maybe even some of the India variants. But it's just a bit more evidence that at least the mRNA vaccines are likely to be effective against several of the variants. Moderna has an ongoing trial for kids 12 to 17 years. They divided the kids 2-to-1 into vaccine and placebo groups, with about 3,000 kids in the vaccine group. And they reported in May that the vaccine was 96% effective at preventing symptomatic infection, which is really incredible. But there are also practical reasons for immunization, as well as medical reasons. If your child is vaccinated, they don't have to deal with uncertain, unpredictable school schedules this coming year. For the last year, on any given day, you could get a call from the school saying to pick up Johnny, and you'd have to drop everything to go and get them, and probably get them tested, and wait for results, and then get clearance to return to school. Or even worse, you could get the call that someone in your child's classroom came back positive, and now they have to quarantine. But if they get vaccinated, then not only do they not have to get sent home, they also don't have to quarantine if their classmate gets COVID. I think we learned in the last year that uncertainty is a huge source of stress, and knowing that you don't have to worry about the possibility of having to transition from in-person to remote learning at any given moment can be such a relief for kids and for parents. Another practicality for at least this coming year is the reality that many venues and events and activities will likely require vaccination for kids 12 and up. I'm already hearing from parents about concerts they want to bring their family to and sports events that are requiring vaccination. If you want to fly anywhere with your family or go on a cruise, you'll likely need everyone who's 12 and up to be vaccinated in order to do that. So all these social activities are clearly at your discretion, so you could easily choose not to do them. But if you're on the fence and you wanted to take your family to the ball game, then this might be a factor. Okay, so more medical reasons. What about the potential long-term effects of COVID? They're the ones we know about, the brain fog and the chest pain and the difficulty breathing. A recent study looked at people who endorsed having symptoms of long COVID, and a year after, a third of them were still symptomatic. We don't necessarily know if all of these sequelae eventually resolve or not. Many of them do, but it's been well less than 100% so far. There are plenty of people having prolonged symptoms, and we don't know if they'll all eventually resolve or not. And also, in addition to the ones that I mentioned, we're also learning that you could end up with erectile dysfunction. I'm not saying you will, I'm just saying you can. And what teenage boy wants that? So these are the ones we know about, but then there may also be long-term effects that we don't know about yet. So while we don't see effects of vaccination that show up after the first 6 weeks, the same isn't true for infections. There are infections that have effects that don't show up until years or even decades later. Some, like shingles, can cause some complications, but they're primarily just unpleasant. Others, like measles in kids, you can get the infection and think you're fully recovered, and then 2 to 10 years later, you get a kind of encephalitis, an inflammation of your brain called sclerosing subacute panencephalitis that's fatal within the next few years. And we just don't know if COVID is going to do anything like that. We just don't have that data. Sometimes viruses do weird stuff. Vaccines don't have stuff that shows up years later, but viruses definitely do. Then there's MIS-C, the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. And this is a complication of COVID infection that can happen concurrently with infection, but more frequently happens a few weeks after infection. It seems to be a kind of inflammation of the blood vessels. Because blood vessels are in literally every organ system in the body, can cause problems in any organ system. And maybe not surprisingly, it can also cause myocarditis. We've seen about 2,600 cases in kids in the US so far. It generally shows up in kids 6 to 14 years. Number 5, there have been about 450 deaths in kids under the age of 18 years, which is a big number, and nobody wants to have any deaths in children. And okay, it's a very small number relative to the number of cases of COVID in kids, especially when you take into account the fact that many kids will be asymptomatic. Still, from now on, these are going to be considered preventable deaths, and there are already people experiencing complicated grief from losing family members that had the opportunity to get vaccinated and chose not to. And those family members have to process the regret of not being able to convince their family member to make a different choice, in addition to the grief of having lost their loved one. And I don't want you to ever have to experience that. And all the rest of this stuff is just details. So what are some of the logistical details that you might also want to know? 1, is the dose different for kids versus adults? So for the 12 to 15 year age group, dose is the same as it is for adults. which makes sense. Physiologically, a 13-year-old is much more like a 20-year-old than they are like an 8-year-old. And they may not act like it, but they're post-pubertal, so they have bodies that are more like adults than they are like children. 2. What about the timing of COVID vaccines with other vaccines? There was briefly a recommendation to avoid other vaccinations for 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after COVID vaccination. And this was done out of an abundance of caution, but none of the vaccines given to this age group are live vaccines. So there's no real medical justification for doing this. And so they recently eliminated that recommendation. In response, the AAP actually issued a statement in support of that change. So what if my child is allergic to eggs, or latex, or amoxicillin, or peanuts, or something else? If your child has allergies to medications or foods, then that probably won't cause problems with this particular vaccine, but they would probably be asked to stay at the vaccine administration site for 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes. If your child has ever had an allergic reaction to injectable medications, or have had infusions of medications and had reactions to those medications, basically anything that requires a needle or an IV, then you should talk to your pediatrician before scheduling them an appointment for this vaccine. Should I give my child Tylenol before their vaccination? We typically recommend that parents hold off on giving a child medication before or immediately after vaccination, just because it can suppress the immune response. And the goal of vaccination is to mount the most robust immune response that you can. If your child can tolerate the side effects of the vaccination, they're going to get more out of it if they can avoid taking anything for it. But if they're uncomfortable, you can absolutely give them a pain reliever, just to make it a little easier for them. When will younger children be able to get the COVID vaccine? So both the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna have ongoing trials in younger kids. The Pfizer trial has about 5,000 kids, and they're reporting that they hope to have results by September. And this is for kids divided into 2 groups, the 6 months to 5 years and 5 to 11 years. Moderna also has a trial with kids 6 months to 11 years. This one has about 6,500 kids, and we don't have a lot more information about that one yet. When it comes out, should my 7-year-old get the COVID vaccine? The answer to that question is definitive. It depends. I'm not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't get that vaccine because, first of all, that's not the way this works. I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. I'm just going to give you the most accurate and evidence-based information that we have so that you can make the right decision for your family. Second of all, we don't have the data yet. We can't make an evidence-based decision before we have the data. When the data comes out, I'll meet you back here and we can talk about it. So I hope this makes it a little easier to make this difficult decision. And as always, remember that the best way to take care of your kids is to take care of yourself. Thanks for joining me. You know, buddy, I'm kind of in the middle of something here. Maybe we could have lap time later, like during editing. What do you think?